Welcome back to the Marketing Factor. Today I'm talking with Jon Howard, the founder of JoHo Co. He is a fractional CMO who's spent over decades in the outdoor industry. Jon has a really unique background. He went from being a magazine publisher in the ski and snowboard world to running marketing for brands like Craft Sportswear. Jon and I go back, almost, I'd say 12, 13 years, Jon. Is that right?
I'm not counting, but I think it's more.
We worked together on a brand called Supernatural, who I feel like was one of the first in the field and maybe potentially a little early. What do you think?
Yeah, they were definitely early to the game. They were an apparel brand that was actually factory owned, which was quite unique. But they were a full on wool story. And that was obviously in the days where Smart Wool and Icebreaker were up and well and healthy, but there was still very much a base layer focus. And Supernatural really took it to outerwear and lifestyle pieces that had not really been introduced yet. But it was fun. Got to work with some great people. Andy and John, the executive team, came from some top-notch brands beforehand. I really enjoyed working with those guys.
What was unique about them? It is like, we're thinking like 2014. This is the start of the direct consumer era, and brands, I felt like, were still trying to figure it out what their positioning was, because a lot of, and maybe you see this a lot in the outdoor industry, but the positioning sometimes is, hey, here's what makes this product unique. The fact that it's wool and it's blended with, polyester or whatever in it. So you still get this wicking fabric, and you're trying to tell that story through such a product focused lens that I feel like now brands have shifted away from that, because there is so much information being bombarded towards them on Instagram or whatever they're seeing. Do you see that shift too?
Oh, what was interesting with Supernatural too is they, like you said, they were omni-channel by, from technically speaking, but they, right at the end of their U.S. existence, they're still in Europe. They were pushing hard D2C, very fast, very quick, and they had a technical story, but they were very lifestyle. I don't know if you remember, like the product imagery and the product designer, I think his name was Phil. Like it was a look that you or I hadn't seen yet in the outdoor world. And it was pretty fun to, be pushing away from that technical story and into this more lifestyle story, which just then took off everywhere.
Yeah, I feel like the brands that I've seen that have utilized that lifestyle story the most from something like kind of technical, and this is an apparel focus, but I feel like YETI kind of took that playbook and really amplified it. And now everyone from apparel brands to, CPG brands are adding in this lifestyle flavor, and where the product details are such secondary kind of selling points for what makes a brand unique nowadays.
There's a lot of great product out there,
There's 100%.
There's too much good product out there, really, and you can't differentiate on text and specs too much. It's hard to find bad product, really,
So how do you talk to, now you work with multitude of different brands in the space that probably still come a little bit from that, I wouldn't say old world style of thinking, because they've seen this, they're polished enough in this at this point, but they still think that their product is the best because of XYZ. How do you get them to start thinking a little bit more from a lifestyle strategy perspective?
A lot of it comes from, when I onboard with the client, I would spend some time, just like you guys do, right? When you onboard, it's a deep dive. It's a lot of time and investment. and we'll go through a pretty deep competitive analysis just to understand what's out there. And that really helps paint the picture of, wow, you're overlapping with everyone else that you're competing against, or you're starting to create a little white space for the first opportunity to over here on this quadrant of the story. And that really visually, truly, because it becomes a visual exercise, opens people's eyes a little bit. Like, we're talking the same way about the same things to the same people to 5 of our top competitors. And we can't. It won't work. And typically there's been a push in some type of channel, some type of paid channel with that type of strategy and mindset, and they're not seeing any results. And that kind of like seals the deal. Like, you've been doing this, it's not working. You brought someone like myself in. Here's the landscape that you're trying to operate in, and it's just not working. So you have the data, but then you also have a visual of like, just a simple outlay of data that's showing that you're speaking to the same people the same way, and it just gets it's inefficient, and it's just not long term.
Yeah, and I think the data is a really good reference point for CEOs for the most part, because they kind of come back to that a lot. You do find that CEOs in some of these brands are actually being pretty invested in the overall marketing strategy of what's going on too. So after you outline the data points, the next step that I generally take, and tell me if this differs from you at all, but is to say, okay, here's what your competitors are doing. Here's what makes you unique. Here are the assets that you have. Where is that white space, like you said, that we can find, and really dig in and own a very specific channel, let's say, or form of content or differentiator?
I think you're spot on. The only thing that I would layer in there is taking some of your other data points, such as customer reviews, order history, layering all that together, and developing some personas and avatars to be able to take those creative assets that you have and either rejigger them, or depending if you're creating those in-house or working with external teams, you might need to tweak. It's easy to tweak the messaging. Sometimes it's a little bit harder for that visual element, but without that real specific lens on who you're speaking to, again, you're then speaking to the masses and speaking to everyone the same way everyone else is. But if you're really lasered in on 3 or 4 different personas, you can really start building out some really strategic and tactical plans to leverage that data.
And then you can use that, I feel like, in everything. And the obvious first place for me, besides the website or what you're posting on organic, is email, and really diving into like, all right, what are people getting when they're signing up for email for this brand? How are we telling the story there? I feel like that's a really nice starting point as you start crafting the overall marketing vision, as like a very simple way to have something that you're building out that's telling the story. That's not just, in some cases it could be, hey, the founder started this because they had XYZ and they figured out that this was the best solution for them. But more so, how do you when you're building out a welcome flow, how do you bring people into the world that you're trying to create with a brand?
Just to add to that, because I think that that customer journey really starts there, right? Where we've also layered some of that messaging is through all the other touch points. Maybe it's into retail, making sure that messaging and those key personas our wholesale team is aware of, the PR team is aware of, and really layering it across. So then that customer journey, right, which is coming from all different sources, when it does transcend down to your site, it's speaking that same thing right through and through. And a lot of times you'll see that a little bit, especially when you're working with like a external PR team that, they're chasing certain data and certain metrics and certain media hits. And if you can kind of direct them of where you're going as well and where you're really building from the ground up on that persona, I think it's helped. I've seen it help change things pretty quickly, and then right down to a paid level, right? Because then now you're speaking, instead of trying to spread it out across 15 SKUs, you're down to 4 SKUs and 3 personas, and it's tight and effective.
Walk me through like what's happened in the outdoor industry between COVID and now.
Yikes. COVID was the boom, right, in the outdoor industry. Everyone wanted to get outside. It's the only thing you could do. Some places you couldn't even do that. But with brands that I was working with then, it was very much a hold on, just like everyone else, right? And then all of a sudden, we knew wholesale was going to be in a really tough spot. Doors were shutting, people were at home. But then people realized they had some extra money. They weren't going out to dinner anymore, and people were buying, anything they could. Nothing big, such a paddle sports was a tough one, right? You weren't going to get a canoe delivered to your house. But, apparel and footwear, backpacks, and, anything that people could use to get outside just took off. And our e-com and some of the brands I was working with, it was, if you were set up, and not everyone was ready for that. And if you were set up to take advantage of that and had a little bit of a strategy in place, and no one had the ultimate strategy, right? We were all chasing whatever we could. So just kind of moving along that, everyone was kind of feeling that growth and saw the opportunity, took advantage of it. But then as, that bubble was still there, and it lasted probably in the outdoor industry longer than a lot of others. Then unfortunately, retailers started opening up, which was very fortunate. But then everyone was starting to buy from a retailer or from an inventory position, heavy based on this historical demand. And it really was tough because that bubble eventually started to soften and shrink. And what we saw was huge inventory and not healthy channels. People were discounting, need to move products. The participation levels weren't necessarily dropping, but they just were flattening, right? And so you weren't having this nice month over month, and people were budgeting year over year growth. And it's like, you can't budget year over year growth based on a, macro event like that. We can see certain cycles, as I'm sure you and your team do, with, election events and such things like that, but not something like COVID. So then now I think we're probably in the healthiest spot we have been. Now it's just, but at the same time, there's other macro issues, right? The macro climate is a bit volatile at best right now, and so there's definitely been a bit of like a reevaluation of like, all right, what is the true baseline business that you're seeing in the outdoor industry? And I do spend a little time outside, just outdoor and just active lifestyle as a whole. And that greater active lifestyle, whether it's outdoor endurance, snow sports, whatever it might be, they all saw it, they all felt it. And they're all trying to recalibrate based on what we've learned and then what we're in. And those are two different things in themselves.
Yeah. No, it's a little bit of a mindset shift for sure, because like you were saying, everyone's budgeting towards growth and they're not seeing those. I mean, I would say majority of our clients are like, why is this year flattening out so much compared to last year? And it's a it I think there's numerous factors that go into that, especially when you look at the paid landscape. I think that
Mm.
obviously Meta is more expensive now. You can't just buy a customer as cheaply as you could before. There's so much more competition. I think that probably people are not actually converting as much as they were before, or not necessarily even engaging with ads as they were probably, in the past. They're getting a little, they're trying to do a little bit of dopamine detox, probably, especially in the outdoor world. You'd think that that's a pretty healthy community for the most part, that's thinking through that. So they're probably, it's a tougher customer to find. Where do I think when you think outside of that, the next place that goes in my mind of, okay, where is like a valuable opportunity, is through influencers and partnerships. How do you like, for lots of brands, they're like, we don't even know where to get started with influencers and partnerships. And how do we build those relationships? What's kind of do you have a playbook for how you do that?
I would say there's more of a strategy than a playbook, because influencers may not always fall into the strategy that you're trying to execute, but they're a great tool for when it does align. And when does it align? I think there's more opportunity now to align with just an influencer strategy, not necessarily just say influencers specifically, but strategy than ever, because of exactly what you just said, which was there's so much like dopamine detox and so much fatigue, right? There's so much fatigue of another ad, another beautiful landscape shot, or another great technical video. But when it's through something that brings authenticity and a little bit of credibility that you're not involved with, is to me not necessarily the next chapter, but another tool in the tool belt, right? Those people I think are going to give. You look at some of the data out there now, and the tools that are out there for some of these influencers and content creators and whatever you want to call them now, and it's brands are looking for people to tell their stories, and they have them. That's not, whether it's ambassadors or teams or whatever they put together, but these people now with the influencers, their ability to tell your story, a good one, a good influencer will tell your story to their audience through their lens. And that to me is a bit of a curve that we haven't been able to achieve before, right? We could certainly have ambassadors and people that were getting paid by us directly. Obviously influencers are as well, but in a different realm than someone that's one of your pro athletes. And yeah, they may have equal enough in terms of audience and maybe reach and potentially engagement. But I find that the influencers just add that layer of credibility that you can't. I don't like using authenticity because it's just so overplayed, but that credibility that you need to monitor, because the influencers, and on the other hand, there's a lot of those out there now, right? In every market, there's another influencer, some more than others, and you'll start seeing in I don't know if you've seen them, but certain comments on some of these influencers, like, this person will sell anything, this person will, and they're calling them out. But that goes back to that credibility. Like, there's no whole bar, people get a little bit of, feel a little bit of like screen courage because they're not face to face and they can just type a comment in. But it highlights, you got to be thoughtful when you approach influencers, and it's not that you need 20. I'm more of the mindset of like, go long with fewer than go shorter with many. Mm-hmm. Because I think if you all of a sudden pop up on someone's feed across 10 different influencers versus 2 or 3 telling your story, and not just doing product reviews, but bringing it on trips, engaging with the product in everyday use, whatever it is, I think that goes a long, long way.
Have you heard of this trend called clipping culture. It's
No.
relatively new to me, but so there's basically a couple platforms that you can use, and you basically you can upload a little bit about your brand, and you'll have an army of influencers that are just generating content and putting it
Yeah.
out there on TikTok, Instagram, whatever. That's just runs the thousands of little like content pieces. And to me it's so black hat and just like gross in terms of what you're describing as like the ultimate betrayal of a brand, like just kind of getting out there and getting away from what is the community focused aspect. But you see more and more brands do it, and I hope that it doesn't become a trend that more mainstream brands take on, because I don't think that it's good for marketing as a whole or the industry, to embrace tactics like that, in the long run.
No, not in, when you get into these passion driven sports, it's, you'll be called out quicker than you realize. And it's interesting that you bring that up. I didn't realize that term, but I know exactly what you're talking about, and explored one this about 8 months ago, and it seems counter, right, to like what
Mm-hmm.
you really want to do. And you're flooding versus, it's a bit of that, shotgun versus sniper approach. And I'm sure people will jump on that bandwagon quickly.
It's a sugar high, I think that it ultimately dilutes the brand. I mean, I guess it depends on the type of brand. If you're selling like, electrolyte powders or something, maybe it makes sense or something like that. But I think for, bigger brands that want to have longevity and, you know, create community, that you there's a difference between broad awareness versus like targeted communities. I love the idea of like, you know, an audience of 10, like you're speaking to an audience of 10,
Mm-hmm.
um, who are like super passionate, and then they go on to build it out. I think you have experience with like run clubs and things like this, or like running events, and I think that that's a really good way to get the type of awareness that you want through a targeted community aspect approach. What are other ways that you've seen that brands maybe that aren't in the running world that can utilize that same kind of idea to build more targeted communities?
I think it's only a little bit more of a thought process of like, like the run clubs weren't really touched for years, and then people are like, ooh, and then brands started to start their own, like, oh, that's not going to work, so let's start partnering with some of these. And they don't, you know that you can't, that's like walking into someone's house, right? You can't just walk in as a brand to a run club that people have been running blood, sweat, and tears for, whether it's just a couple weeks or a couple months or a couple of years. um, so it's a matter of, in my opinion, finding that opportunity early enough. And it gets back to looking at a bit of your competitive landscape and saying, what's not being done? Who's not being spoken to? Who can really find value in our product that we or no one else has reached yet? And I think run clubs is a perfect example of like a community, a group of people in a community of people that it can be very powerful. Some of these urban rug clubs are very, very influential, and have started to realize that and started to leverage that at bigger events and getting brand deals, which again then starts steering it away from that a little bit. But I think it's just really about making sure that you get in early on some of these things. Like years ago, right? People started running ads on Meta, low hanging fruit. It was really pretty cost effective, relatively easy. What's next? It's they're out there, and I think it's really, really specific to an industry, because like run clubs are those certainly nationwide, but can those transcend into snow sports, right? Like if you look at the growing backcountry market of snow sports, that's like you don't talk about where you're going backcountry skiing and riding, so it's a little bit more of a, okay, how do we speak to them? How do we understand where they are building that community? Is it organizations and clubs like that, or is it a little bit more of finding a little bit of those leaders, those community leaders that aren't necessarily as organized, because a run club's very organized, but then you find a lot of people who are influential and a bit of those tastemakers in a region, and I think that regional approach can be, for some of these smaller brands, super smart to look at, because you can't compete nationally when you're out of the gate.
How about like brick and mortar stores, right? Like I think of, retailers in general. How do they keep up with like brands selling direct nowadays? Like what's their competitive advantage?
It goes right back to what you just brought up about the run clubs, like those community events. Those community events are huge because they drive people in store. Like those retailers are thinking one thing: how do we get people in store? D2C brands are thinking, how do we get people to our site? Same idea, different platform. And it's I don't know, you probably have seen some of the news. There's been some really large outdoor retailers in the past month that have closed up. And there is some timing where people have done it long enough and maybe they're done. But at the same time, it will change. The lack of those stores in those communities will change the sport or the recreation in those areas, because all you're doing there is speaking to your local community, and you're not getting new customers from across the country or 1,000 miles away being a brick and mortar. Yes, you have your online, and that creates that full experience, but that indoor experience, I think that service is such a huge part of it. I just this weekend went into a store looking for a new backpack, and I knew a zillion places I could have shopped online, but I went in store because I wanted to talk to someone, because my packs were old and I haven't had a backpacking bag in probably 10 years. So I was like, all right, I need to go speak to someone. And it was the best experience. And I think years ago, that experience was a little bit where the service industry was a little bit more like, how can we help you, versus letting you have that initial walkthrough and time spent, and then engaging with the customer. No different than D2C, right? You're on the site. How fast does that pop-up come up? Mm-hmm. Is it a delay? What's that experience? And allowing people to kind of immerse themselves a little bit.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. I was in Brevard, North Carolina last month, and they have a great bike shop there called the Hub. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's just great. Like there's a brewer, or it's like a little tap thing connected to it. It's right at the base of Pisgah National Forest, so there's one entry point up to this, and they rent bikes. And the service that I got, traditionally you go into a bike shop and the guys are generally rude. I don't know if maybe that's just me, but I've always had the experience. I don't know if it's mountain biking, and but more broadly speaking, the bike store salespeople are generally like, oh, you don't know what this tire is or whatever. But this was a completely different experience. I was treated very graciously, with a lot of patience, as someone who doesn't have a ton of mountain biking experience, and I was just like, man, I can't wait to come back here. Like I'm a true like advocate now. But I also think there's a balance between someone like the person who runs the Hub to be like, oh, I found success here. Why don't I branch out and try and do this online too? Right. And they kind of sometimes you can't translate that quite as well sometimes. You can through very targeted way of thinking and strategy around how your email flows and the personalization that's happening on your website. But I do think that there is like this level of just face to faceness that creates community outside of anything digital can do.
Absolutely. You know, the outdoor industry before my time was built on passion and relationships, and as time has evolved and gone by, and people started to notice the growth and opportunity there, you know, it became what I refer to as with some of my friends who've worked in the industry as long as I have. It went from being a bit of a lifestyle play to really becoming business,
Mm-hmm.
and it became this shift. And I think those who still remember that community and passion element will succeed, whether it's D2C or whether it's, you know, brick and mortar or some omni-channel play. It's really evolved. And if you told me 25 years ago that there was going to be holding companies owning some of these brands and PE backed startups in this industry, I would have said, no way. And here we are. It's a different landscape. And there's some people who've embraced it and have figured it out, but it's also evolving, you know, because there's a younger generation out there that are, you know, grown up in a more immediate world where that service, maybe it will come back, but it's certainly paramount for those physical locations.
What about like seasonality, right? Like it's such a big aspect of the outdoor industry in terms of like sales um, and engagement and stuff like that. Do you tell brands to like basically pause or like not pause, but cut back on either marketing spend or cadence of emails when things are slower and build into the growth season? What's your approach there?
My approach used to be a little bit more along those lines. Now I'm a much bigger fan of having an evergreen story that is kind of your baseline, that you're, whether it's a product offering or whether it's certain creative that's always worked and that you're really going to build off of above and beyond that, and meta. But I think there needs to be an absolute baseline to work from, and then you surge when you need to, and you need to be ready to surge, as you know, pretty quick. And so there's the seasonality of it. There's the algorithm doing its thing, and then there's the competition that you're up against at the same time. So, you know, what's interesting is you talk to people that come into the industry and they're looking at month over month metrics, and it's like, we got to be looking year over year. Like this, you know, we look over any J months, and J months are typically super low, underperforming, really tough times of the year. But so if you're comparing a year over year outlook, you can at least have a baseline in terms of where to start. And then again, that evergreen approach with kind of more of these seasonal campaigns to layer on top, I think is a super healthy and effective way. You can budget to it. You can plan creative around it. It's in my opinion, what you have to do right now. And I'm sure there's other ways, but it seems what's worked well.
What about like books that you've read that like shape your thinking? I feel like you feel like a pretty well-read guy, and I'm interested in like books that you've read that shaped your thinking, because it's very rare that you find someone so passionate about outdoor industry, but also so um, smart in thinking this way around the marketing strategy. I'm not saying these people don't exist, but I just feel like You are someone I go to a lot for like guidance on things like this, and I feel like you have a good perspective on these ideas. Are there books that have like shaped your thinking, and not necessarily the outdoor world, but just marketing in general?
I would say in the past year, I have stayed away from marketing books. And solely because I'm consuming content, I feel like all day, even between calls and emails and projects or whatnot, that the marketing books, I feel like there's more in terms of how to think, and this is gonna, you said like, am I well read? You ask my kids, they're like, no, dad reads for like 3 pages before going to bed. And that's as long as he lasts. And which is true. But the last book, and I read because I read it all the time, and it doesn't have anything to do with marketing specifically, but I do think it has a certain mindset that we need to have in today's world. It's called Be Happy. You might have heard it. It's by Dalai Lama, and it's this little pocket book about this big. You can read it in probably 2 nights before going to bed, and it makes you kind of get, I was saying before about like having this baseline and evergreen story, and that's where kind of that came from in a weird way, right? Like you need to be kind of thoughtful and simple and clean headed and with a clear mind. And then when you see opportunity, rise to it, right? And you see the algorithm go, or you see something else. And it just kind of let me, instead of like chasing everything, right? There's so much great information. I don't know about great, but there's a lot of information out there. And it just allowed me to like step back and be like, okay, what makes sense and what kind of creates this baseline, and then kind of find where there's a little bit of opportunity above that.
Yeah, I love that. I like you know, books like that are like almost like you can just pick up in the middle and just get a jolt of inspiration, or at least centeredness, like a meditative sort mindset shifts, thinking through like self-discovery a little bit. um one I read that I suggest, that's really good. It's called The Pivot Year. It's one that you can just kind of pull up any page and you kind of get a little frame shifting in terms of your thinking, because you can kind of like, you can get stuck in your way of thinking a lot, especially going through now. It's a pretty everything's changing, and we have such you know we're old men now, so we get like rooted in our ways of the way that we think. But I think that in order to stay fresh and creative is like a really good practice, kind of like pick up things like that. Well, cool, man. Well, what other brands are you looking at right now that you feel like are crushing it in the outdoor space?
There's a lot. um, there's some of these brands that I learn about just by going down the rabbit hole on your feed, right? And some of them are so, and I'm a 52-year-old dad, and so I've fit a certain demographic, and all of a sudden you learn of all this menswear brands that are, and all of a sudden something will actually look different. And it's because they're telling a different story. Their product is no different, but they're telling a different story. Taking it to the outdoor world, I think who I've always been a big fan of is Rumpl, the blanket company, like such a simple, and I think it was last Christmas over Cyber Week, the CEO on LinkedIn had mentioned like their campaign was all about just color, just their color story for the Q4. And it was like, how simple is that? Such a simple product, simple message. It can translate to so many, but it was just very specific. I always admire what those guys have done with a blanket. Certainly has evolved from there a bit, but like their hero product is something your house has probably got 10 of, and maybe it has one Rumpl, but like, who would have thought? They do a really good job.
Yeah, they're super cool. And they have any way that you can have like a simple way to tell that story, I feel like is so powerful. Jon, thanks so much for coming on the Marketing Factor. Where can people find out more or learn more about you?
Easiest place is website, JoHoandCo.com, or you can hit me up on email or LinkedIn.
Thanks, man.
Thank you.